Okay. Here we go. Okay. So we're going to talk about writing and teaching philosophies and diversity statements. And we'll talk about the importance of them and who wants them and why you want them and all that good stuff. But for now, I'll do my usual career services spiel, that our services are open pretty much to anyone even tangentially involved with University of Idaho. And so even if you've graduated, you take a break and you're like, yeah, I want to go back to grad school or something like that, we can always help you, even though you're not currently enrolled, right? So available for alumni and things like that. So perfectly within your realm of reason to take a break, think about grad school later if you want, and also just come back to us so we can help you do that. And so, again, if you're here today and you're thinking about diversity statements, if you're thinking about teaching philosophies, personal statements, statement of purposes, right? We're all happy to meet on any of those, as well as the things you see on the screen, all within our purview and our capability of helping you with, and we're all excited to talk about that stuff. So you can always, if you double check, like, oh, I'm not so sure I can go to career services for that, you more often than not can probably schedule an appointment with us for that. And so once you hit on Vandalstar here, you'll see all our wonderful faces on here and what colleges we're associated with. And so you can sign up with us that way, or you can kind of sign up just like, for example, I need an appointment at 12 on Tuesday. Then you could see who's all available on that. So pretty flexible system. And of course, if you need drop-in appointments, Monday to Fridays, 11 to 1, we'll always have someone on deck for that. So we'll now get into the reason we're all here today: philosophy statements for teaching, diversity statements, and so on and so forth. So teaching philosophy statements, why do universities and employers ask you for them? If you are someone who has taught before, or you're thinking about teaching, you'll often hear or be taught or have conversations about what kind of teaching persona you want to have. There's a lot of different styles on teaching, a lot of different methods, modules, practices, pedagogies that you can use. And so really, this is kind of your cover letter, although it'll be a bit longer. You can go to 2 pages, where they kind of want to get to know you as a teacher. So if the cover letter wants to get to know you as a candidate for like an employer-related job, a teaching philosophy is kind of similar in getting to know you as a teacher, like what styles you are, or what kind of literature or pedagogies have inspired you. And so we'll talk about the why and the how when we get into the actual writing of it. So what feels challenging about writing these documents? I think anything, right, that taps into core beliefs or personal writing or anything like that can inherently be challenging, to just kind of, again, if you have been teaching for a long time, or you just started out teaching, either way, I think it could be challenging to just kind of sit back and be reflective and remind yourself, oh, why do I teach that way? And so that could be challenging in that nature, but also very productive, because you can kind of, again, take a step back and write and figure out, oh, why do I teach that way? Or why do I want to teach that way? So it can be productive in the same light here. So again, it conveys your teaching values, beliefs, and goals. We always want to know the why behind the practices you're doing, right? So it's kind of, I consider it a layered approach of, you're going to let them know what you do or what you want to do when teaching students. And then you want to let them know how you're doing it. That could be, for example, labor-based grading, or you're more student-centered. And so you believe in more discussion-based activities, right? We were gonna, get into the specifics when we write this. And then always, I think it's a good practice for all writing, good practice for all, you're a teacher, you're gonna be a leader. So all leadership practices, right? You can tell someone what to do, you can tell someone how to do it, but it's always important to let people know why you're doing it. right? These are documents in which you want them to believe in you, right? And the practices and the things that you're doing. And in order to get these universities or employers or committees to believe in you, speaking about the why you're doing it is super important. Which again goes into the the justification, right? Reflexivity and purposefulness, right? When we often talk about documents, these little elements of thoughtfulness and purposefulness in a cover letter, for example, it's just a little paragraph where you're showing the employer you've done some research on them. And we can talk about that in this genre, right? There's a slide coming up, and we'll just kind of remind ourselves the basic principles of rhetoric. And again, this document is for letting them know, who you are as a teacher, how you like to instruct, how you feel that it's helpful for the student demographic or population you're teaching, because student demographics can be a bit different from university to university, which we'll talk about shortly. So this is the slide I'm referring to when I always like to tell people, remember your rhetoric. So not all institutions are built the same. Even if you're like me, for example, and you've been an English instructor, not all English departments are built the same, if I could use the English example. And so you want to know typically what your institution that you're applying to or grad programs where you might be teaching, what they're interested in. Some folk are more interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, which we'll talk about later. Some people are more interested, if I can keep using English examples, they're more interested in longer research-based writing. They're more interested in the research elements. Some people really are interested in the student stuff, so you want to keep thinking about that. But also, it's not just a departmental and instructional thing, it's also who's your student population, right? Very important to think about who you're serving and who you're teaching when you're writing these teaching philosophies, because those are the folk that are going to absorb and be a part of your teaching practices. And so you want to make sure, as is all rhetoric, that when you study the people you are trying to persuade, that you are using the best strategies you can employ to persuade them. And so knowing the student demographic can help you write these documents, because let's say, for example, that your student base is primarily a first generation and commuter base. The way you would teach those folk would, or you would talk about diversity or inclusion would be different than maybe an R1 institution where they're all living on campus. Maybe their parents have gone to college, right? There might be a different element in which you would need to speak to how you would teach those differing populations. So it can be, again, a 1 to 2 page narrative, right? Like, I think when you do these, you're going to find that they're going to, reach into 2 pages more often. And I want to let everyone know that that's okay, right? It doesn't have to be this rigid 1-page cover letter deal. But you want them to know your educational purpose and learning goals for students, right? Perhaps even what you have taught, what you're excited to teach, excuse me. Again, which goes back to the previous slide of what do they like to teach? What can you provide for them as an instructor? And your teaching methods and models and methods for assessing student learning. Again, the way you assess students, super important based on their population. I personally loved using labor-based grading to reach my students. And if I were to write a diversity statement and or teaching philosophy, that'd be a core part of how I would write that, because that's a core part of who I am as a teacher. And I believe in it, right? And it's those practices that you believe in that are going to be the most intriguing and thoughtful things for both parties. And so those methods for assessing are always important, and how you teach, again, like we talked about, super important. So when you do these things, right, however you like to brainstorm or organize is all up to you. But you can, again, reflexivity is super important. So what literature, right, like any kind of pedagogy you have learned or that you've looked up, that has inspired you? What kind of experiences have shaped you where you're like, oh, I loved when my mentor did this, right? And so this is a core part of how I teach, or something like that, can all be factors on how you write these documents. And so reflecting and doing that little initial brainstorming is always an important thing in these. So this slide says to begin at the end. This is usually can be a helpful teaching tactic when you, I think, I don't remember the terminology off the top of my head, but there is teaching documents you can fill out that help you teach this way too on a day-to-day basis. You kind of start at the end, like, what do I want my students to learn? Or what knowledge, practices, or things do I want them to have when they leave at the end? And so when you know that, it's like I don't know if it's called backwards planning. It might be called backwards planning, but when you start at the end and you have those core skills and things that you want the students to learn, then you can kind of start at the beginning and figure out, okay, so how do I give them, what's the most effective ways to give them that knowledge or to let them practice that knowledge and develop those skills. And so that's why, sometimes beginning at the end is a helpful exercise in figuring out what you want the students to walk away with, because then it could help you write how exactly I would approach that.
Jake, someone in the chat said understanding by design. So maybe that's the name of part of what you're talking about.
It could be, yeah, that or backwards planning for sure, like in terms of just like a nice little heuristic, right, where you can kind of figure out how do I design this to get them to understand, right? Like, so yeah, I think I'll look that up later because I think it'd be nice to see what that looks like.
And real quick, we did have a question,
Yeah.
but if you're gonna cover it later, they were asking what labor-based grading is. So if you're gonna talk about that.
I mean, I might dive more into it when I get, but not like at the core. So labor-based grading, if you want to know about it, I don't know if I will be able to spell his name correctly, so I apologize. I don't know. You boy. I apologize to him, but he's so big time he won't even know. He has worked on labor-based grading, and at the heart, labor-based grading, which is different than contract grading. There's a lot of people who do contract grading who still have they still grade subjectively. And labor-based contract grading is a contract that you and the student agree upon at the beginning of the semester that basically says, this is what you have to do to get a B. You have to do all these things. If you want an A, then you might have to write another paper, or you might have to do an interview, or whatever your course goals are, right? You basically establish criteria in a written form of all of these things that you do this semester will get you a B, right? And the idea behind it is that at its heart, it's supposed to promote risk-taking, because if the grade is not synonymous with feedback, then you at the core can maybe take a little bit more risks with the writing or the project. And then it's supposed to really, help, I think help mental health, right? Because if you understand how you're going to be graded, then you can kind of, again, risk-taking, go at the project with a little bit more creativity or a little bit more passion. And then also, I think, which is why I'll bring it back up in the diversity, equity, inclusion section, I think it's really helpful for folk who, have families, have jobs, commute, to know, how they're going to be graded and know if they do these things, they're going to get this grade as well. And we can continue that. But that's in spirit kind of what that is. And I'm a big believer in it. And that's why I would put it in both my documents, because I think at the core, it's what I believe in for teaching, in terms of, again, grading doesn't have to be synonymous with feedback. And I think that hurts, as we know, a lot of grades bleed into scholarships, bleed into financial aid, right? So not to end that huge tangent, you can tell that would be a big part of my documents. So let me go back here. Okay. Let me see here. So we've got a few approaches to how you can do this. So I'm just gonna kind of get them all out here. We've kind of touched on the spirit of these things, right? So again, we're gonna get into, there'll be a slide about specifics, but I want to put the words specificity in your mind because again, resumes, cover letters, even these documents, right? I always try to say they're contextless documents in which you try to provide them as much context as possible, right? You try to paint as specific and clear of a picture for your employer and or university as a grad program as much as possible. So they can try to figure out who you are, and in this case, as a teacher, to the best of their ability. And so in that, our tool to do that is specificity. And so for this slide here that says classroom models you will use, flipped classroom, discussion-based, student-centered approaches, all of those things, right? Really give you at its core the terminology, if you know that you have been practicing this stuff, to let them know this is what I believe in as a teacher. This is how I teach the students. And so that specificity helps them figure out if the marriage is right or if the match is right between you all. And again, that is the how, right? The pragmatics of purpose. So they want to know, like, why do you want to be a teacher? Why do you want to continue teaching? And when you tell them those kind of specifics, that helps them figure out what you believe in, right? So this is the specificity section. So letting them know how you're teaching is great. I kind of hinted at this at the beginning. It's really good to let them know, right? It's still a professional document, so you still want to exude your qualifications a little bit. And so you do want to tell them like what courses you have taught, what courses you're prepared or eager to teach. I think is one thing when I've done these in the past. I made the mistake of not telling them like, this is what I would be excited to teach at your institution or program. This is what I can teach at your institution or program. And so if I were to do it differently, I would for sure include that because I left that out. And I think that was, a little bit of a mistake because then they learned less about who I am and what I've done and what I would like to do. And so that's one thing on this slide, I think that I've made the mistake in the past. So that I always like to bring that up. I'm not going to go too much into the examples. I believe this gets posted so you can kind of take a look at it. The only thing I would say for the examples as you go along and read this, or if you read it later, is I personally would like more specificity in these examples. Like, because you can see the bottom paragraph, it's like teaching involves designing experiences for students that promote deep learning, involves providing students with opportunities to practice concepts, ideas and skills. That's great, but like then I'm asking in my head as I'm reading that how, right? I've been an English teacher for over 5 years. If I have to ask you what, how, or why, you're probably not being specific enough, right? And so just that little checklist as you're writing can do wonders for you. You just reread the paragraph and you go, oh, I didn't actually tell them how I would do this. That's not a good thing, right? And so that's what I would just say in the future. If you go look at these examples again, great to tell them like your feelings, your purpose, and what you believe in, but you gotta also tell them how and why you do it. Here's some resources for later and in terms of like, again, more resources just past this presentation on ways in which you can write a teaching philosophy statement, just in case you want some additional opinions, which is always a good thing, right?
And the slides will be posted in the Canvas course, or if you want to give me email addresses, we can send them to you after so you can click on them.
I'll kind of like pause. Any questions on teaching statements before we dive into like a diversity statement? No? Okay. So we're going to talk about diversity statements now. So you might also be asked to write a diversity statement as well as the teaching philosophy. So there's going to be times where you're going to write both of them. And so why do universities employers ask for them? Diversity and equity and all of that. Super important, right? I think fundamentally, but also, from a university standpoint, probably important legally, right? In a legality sort of way. And you all who have been invested and around in the university settings know that we're always trying to increase opportunities for diversity, equity, inclusion, right? And so as you are a teacher, you are kind of some kind of leader or some kind of pillar in their community is kind of the flowery way they probably will tell you. And so you are also in charge of increasing diversity inclusion. Now, this could be anything from the way you teach, again, labor-based contracts, I feel is a pretty good realm into that. Student-centered, giving students more agency, you can make a claim for that, right? As we get through these slides, you'll see you will also kind of justify how you teach as it would relate to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so what's challenging about writing these documents? I think it's just a similar rhythm, right? Like you're sometimes teaching again becomes embedded or second nature, and you're asking yourself to pause and reflect and ask if what you've been doing has been working, right? Again, super productive, but also challenging because teaching is a hard business to begin with. And you kind of always are checking yourself to see, like, am I reaching students? Am I being inclusive enough? And so again, just a similar thing to the teaching philosophy and its difficulties, but also can be really, really productive. So I'm going to bring these back up again. You're going to see, again, to me, at least the structure of writing these is similar, and you're gonna show me the what, the how, and the why, but it's going to be the subjectivity now is related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when, again, you talked about labor-based grading in your teaching philosophy, maybe you want to know, or they want to know now, if applicable, how that relates to being inclusive or equitable or diverse, right? And again, I think it is, so I would write about it in my diversity statement. But a lot of what's going to happen here is how you have fostered and promoted diversity, equity, inclusion in the past, how you intend to foster diversity, equity, inclusion in the future when you work there. I think a slide will cover that, so I probably just jumped ahead of myself. But again, you want to talk about your future commitments. You want to talk about your past successes with it when talking about all of this. So some common prompts you'll see is describe your past, present, and future contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion. I'm not gonna, read all of them out loud because you can kind of get a glimpse at them here, but you can see that you often will get a prompt like this. Again, just gonna prompt you on talking about how you have done DEI, how you will continue to do DEI. That sort of rhythm.
Can I ask a question?
Yep.
And maybe you're gonna cover this later, but is it valuable to express how you like conceptualize those topics? Because they're different from each other. Like, is that part of it? Or do you look at their mission statement, see how they conceptualize it, and then talk about it in that way? I
would do both. I think I think one of the slides will mention how do you define all three, right? And I think to your point, that's important. So they have a grasp of how you define it, right? I'm not going to get super into it. It's like a CRT article, but how we define things is in the academy is really important because if you've ever noticed certain offices are renaming themselves a lot, it's super important to kind of figure out what your name is or what you are titling, diversity. Are we diversity and inclusion? Are we multicultural affair, right? There's going to be different names because there's a lot of consequences and a lot of charged things at stake when you think about definitions, right? And so when you're defining it, it's important because then they know what you believe in or how you would define it or how you would categorize the three different things. So that's always helpful. And to your second point, when we think about rhetoric, again, it's always important to know how they're defining it, because, not to be missed in this whole presentation, but these are documents to get you hired and you are persuading them. And so, the basic, at least college definition of rhetoric is Aristotelian in finding all the available means of persuasion. And so knowing your audience is one of those strategies in being able to persuade them. If you know your audience, you know what they believe in and what makes them tick, which in this case would be related to their definitions, then you can kind of make that match. And when they read the document, like, oh, wow, this person's really would be a really good fit for us, right? And so that's kind of the two-pronged approach for that method.
Well, you don't plagiarize their actual mission statement, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, you don't want to be inauthentic, right? We'll get to that point, and we'll talk about like what it means to just rifle off buzzwords and not back it up, right? Like you're gonna seem inauthentic. So like, you know, part of the deal is like trying to come to that authentic like middle ground, for sure. So here's some structures. I know, you know, some people like being open-ended, some people like structure. So here's the slide on structure, just in case you want a good kickstart on how you would format your paragraphs or your progression. You can again talk about your past experiences and ways of doing present and then future. You can talk about your values, which is again, perhaps where we could define diversity, equity, inclusion, experiences that have helped shape those values, future plans, or DEI in research teaching, and DEI in blank, which I would assume to be in your future role. In all of these, I would probably advise and guide to not leave out how you have fostered DEI in the past. I think, again, because these are professional documents, they still kind of want some proof for credibility that you have been doing it in the past, so that they are a little bit put at ease and assured that you can continue to do it in the future, right? And so that's something I would consider as well. Again, another example, I'm not going to go too much into these at length. I think these examples suffer from the same example previously, where I would like to know the how. And maybe I'm jumping ahead of myself, and if this were a full-fledged document, they would get to the how. But they kind of talked about their past experience in it, which is great, especially for the diversity document is talking about like what were your past experiences in this, so they know that you were already kind of embedded in it, already doing it, right? And you weren't avoiding it. So that's important for this genre. But again, both of these examples, and we won't go too deep into them. You can read them on the Canvas course if you'd like. I would like to know how they have and will continue to foster DEI through their teaching practices, and all of that stuff. Here's some mistakes, which we kind of hinted at the inauthenticity that could happen, but here's some other pitfalls that you can do, specifically for diversity statements. The theoretical approach, I have studied, therefore I know, right? It's one thing to study and read something, it's another thing to put into practice, right? Teaching and diversity statements are very heavy in the pedagogy, very heavy in the how. And so it's great to read. It's great. You can let them know that you have loved this scholar and they're part of why you do it this way, but I'd still like to know how you're doing it. Identity approach. I don't think it's a bad thing that, like, for me, I'm first generation as a student, and that's why I'm here doing this, right? And so like I don't think it's a bad thing bringing it up, but it can't be the anchor in which you think it qualifies you for something, right? I certainly think being a first generation student would be great at primarily first generation commuter demographic. I think they would want someone like me, right? But it can't be the only thing I hitch my wagon to. I still, again, want to show them why I believe it's important to teach this way for the student demographic or something like that. Acknowledgement approach, I would consider that more like you're like submitting for a conference proposal. Like I don't really think we need to talk about gaps in research or gaps in their approach or anything right now. This is kind of more about your little beginning or your little experiences with this, and then how you would serve the students, right? Which we'll talk about in a second. Savior approach, again, there's no reason to get super overly flowery and like, I'm ready to inspire and change, right? Like we don't need to kind of talk that way. What I need to do is be, as an employer or university person, is to be shown that you've done it in the past, you've experienced, you have been around it, and that you continue to do it or will continue to do it, and show me how to do that. I'm sure we've all been kind of in that realm of don't tell me, show me, all right? And so like that would be telling me, showing me in this instance would be your pedagogical approaches, what kind of places you've already invested yourself in your previous experiences for DEI. And then the diary approach when the whole story is about you. Great to begin with your past experiences and why that has made you interested in diversity, equity, inclusion, but then the subjectivity like needs to change to how you would serve the students, right? DEI is going to be a very student-centered thing, and you need to tell them or show them more, rather how you have done it in the past again and how you're going to do it in the future. So you're okay to start with yourself, but it can't, the subjectivity of it can't always be about yourself, because then you haven't let them know anything about how you're going to help students. Here's some more common pitfalls that we're talking about, right? We mentioned very wisely, like 10 or 15 minutes ago, what it would mean to be inauthentic. And I think something like this is really the fast track to becoming inauthentic. So lip service, generalizations, and incorrect use of terminology would be, to me, the fastest ways to prove that you haven't been in diversity, equity, inclusion. So again, the fastest way to show that you haven't been as involved as you want to be is not telling them how you've done it. So if you're whipping out words like student-based, student-centered, flipped classroom, inclusivity, universal access, and you're not telling them how you're fostering those things in the classroom, in your student hours appointments, in your grading scheme, in your outside involvement of the classroom, it's just going to appear vague, ambiguous, and fake because you're throwing words around and you have not grounded them in reality, right? It's one thing to say all the buzzwords, but then you have to ground them in reality with how you're doing it in your teaching life, with those specifics. We talked about specificity earlier. That's how you would do it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So if you have like philosophy about a lot of these things, but a really limited amount of words, I mean, is it teaching, you said it's like 1 to 2 pages usually? Or
the teaching philosophy 1 to 2 pages, diversity and inclusion, I would probably go the same length. They might have a word count or prompt, so be mindful of what they're requiring you to do. Some places might not give you a prompt or anything like that. You might have already seen that when you're applying for graduate stuff, which is frustrating. But then I would probably lean on what have I known from the past. It's like, okay, if a teaching philosophy is 1 to 2 pages, then I'll probably give the same attention to the diversity inclusion. And we have that kind of consistency in our documents. And so in that realm, I would lean again on my prior teachings, and like I would probably want quality over quantity, right?
Yeah.
And so like if I have one really good experience, then we can blow that out and grow it and make it look like that I have authentically been doing it, which I have, right? I certainly wouldn't be against someone with a lot of experience is kind of listing that this is kind of all the things I've been doing. But like a cover letter, I really want people to slow down and let some experiences breathe a little bit, right? That picture painting. So when you're telling me you've done this and you're showing me how you're doing it, I can believe in you. I can believe that this is the person that was doing this stuff because they showed me how and they're telling me why they believe in it, right? And I think that adds authenticity and credibility to those experiences, which would make them a lot richer than just trying to like put like a finger in the honeypot of like 5 different strategies,
right?
Because they've learned, that's what they've been learning. I'd rather have a rich story or a rich pile of evidence on like one or two things, I think, so.
That makes sense.
That very long tangent to say quality over quantity probably never hurt anybody, so, yeah. Yeah. Brainstorm, so what are your, let me just move this so I can remember what we wrote here. What are your values surrounding DEI specifics? Here's some helpful things that you can kind of use again as a starting point to think about different ways in which we can impact diversity, equity, and inclusion on a campus setting. So removing barriers to access. One of these ways, again, like we talked about, universal design in your courses. If you're someone who has done that or interested in doing that, that's an example of removing barriers to access. So something like that, right? Understanding how race and social identity impacts knowledge production in your field. That could bleed back into the top in access, who has access to what. And again, all of these things can play into how you're doing it in the classroom or how you would do them in the classroom if given the opportunity. Changing practices that unequally structure social relations. Again, could be as simple as student-centered design, right? Trying to deconstruct the power between professor and student as much as possible could be seen as a DEI topic. And then the last two, creating a community where each member feels welcome. Classroom community, how do you foster that in your classroom could be a way of doing it, and so on and so forth. And so these are a nice little couple bullet points in giving you some language to ground your experiences in. This is where we get to the point of like, how would you define these topics, right? And so I think that's, let me see if there's one, okay. That would be a really helpful thing, again, to just how do you define these things? Because if it lines up with how they're defining it, that again is a good little thing of persuasion that you're making that match between them, within the realm of staying authentic, of course. And so I don't mind that if this is making your way into the diversity statement. You're going to talk about your experiences with DEI, right? So that's going to play into your definition as well, right? And so again, not outside the realm of possibility that you would define these things in the statement itself, and I think it would be helpful, and not a bad way of going about it. So here's some ways I think you can do it, right? We talked about the classroom a lot. And we can also talk about different ways in the realm of contributions. So like if you have been doing research, does that involve directly addressing issues of DEI? When I was an English person, I tried a lot to research mental health. How do we make it easier for folk to participate in writing classrooms? And I could argue that by improving mental health, I'm improving issues of DEI, right? I can make that argument with commuter people who have multiple jobs that there's a relationship there. So through my research, I could give that a try in my diversity statement. And so that's one way of addressing it. It's like, have you done some research that can scratch that itch? Service, as the bullet points say, like, have you served on any university or college committees? Have you volunteered? Have you formally mentored students? Have you done any youth outreach, right? Like, I think a lot of the academy, even if they don't privilege service as much as you would like, even in these documents, you can definitely lean on your service, right? I know the academy really likes publications and teaching, but the service doesn't have to be left out if you have a very strong record of service, especially related to DEI. So I think that's another realm of contribution you can think about when writing this. And then, of course, the kind of thing I've talked about a lot and most, because we've talked about the teaching philosophy as well, is what are your contributions to diversity, equity, inclusion in teaching? And so this could be anything from reading course materials, guest lectures, right? Representation is super important in curriculum, assigning readings for us. And I actually don't hate to keep using English examples, but for us is like, if you're creating a rhetoric course, are you including how women practice rhetoric in ancient Greek, or are you just talking about Aristotle, Plato? You know, the regular, like, are you going beyond Western rhetorics to talk about you know, Asian rhetorics and all of that? Like, are you doing that stuff? So readings can be a very fast track way in which you can diversify your course. Teaching students with disabilities, right? There's a whole slew of research on disability studies, right? We talked about universal design. That's one way to try to reach students with varying disabilities. So that could be one way pedagogically you're doing that. We talked about curriculum and have you advised students from underrepresented groups, right? And so again, more of that like teaching, mentoring, service intersection. So what specific actions do you plan to take to create diverse and inclusive spaces? I think we covered right in the structure slide, what your past experiences were, how you fostered it, and what would you do in the future. So I think we're good on that for diversity and inclusivity. So I will now open it back up to everyone else for any questions or concerns or anything related to what we talked about.
Okay, there's a question. How should I weigh the need for specificity in a philosophy statement versus the overuse of the word I? Is that something I should worry about in a philosophy statement? I believe that, I think that, I teach students to, etc.
I mean, I think, most folk, like when we do like rhetoric and writing 101, 102, whatever the course structure looks like here. You know, the personal pronoun thing is not as bad as you might have been taught in high school. The repetition of the personal pronoun is something you might want to think about. Like if you've got 3 to 5 sentences that start with I, you know, then you could fatigue the reader, right? So from a technical aspect, excuse me, that's could be something to think about. But a lot of this stuff is about you and what you believe in and how you do it and why you do it. And so most of the teaching is going to be like we talked about with the diversity, it has to shift to the students and how you would foster that for the students. But it's still, again, revolving around the practices you're doing, right? And so like, as far as the use or overuse of the personal pronoun, I wouldn't be too concerned about it unless you're finding it's really repetitive. And from a technical point of view, you want to like vary the language so that it reads a bit better, or you're giving your reader a little bit of a break from the same sentence start. And you can, you know, schedule an appointment with me and we can talk about that stuff too. I'm sure the Writing Center would love to talk about like, what are some ways we can kind of signpost our beginning of our sentences differently. And so they can help you brainstorm that as well, but that would be my take on that.
So you guys don't mind writing your names. They said, thank you. That
Okay.
was very helpful.
Cool. All right.
Always good. Right. Stop the recording.
Okay.